recorded in the minutes. It wasn't a great summer last year, and clearly Manchester touched very many people. So if we can record our sadness at this anniversary, that would be very useful. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any additional declarations to those set out in the paper? Thank you. Item 3, membership of the committee. Can we note the membership and the chairing arrangements for the year?
Agreed.
Item 4 is the terms of reference. Can we note them?
Agreed.
Item 5, standing delegations. Can we note the standing delegations?
Agreed.
Minutes of the meeting from the 6th of March 2018. Can we agree them as a correct record?
Agreed.
Item 7 is the re-establishment of the Budget Monitoring Subcommittee. Can we note the re-establishment of the subcommittee, the terms of reference, the membership and chairing arrangements, and the schedule of all meetings agreed at the annual meeting? Can we agree to refer automatically the report set out on the agenda to the subcommittee for the 18-19 Assembly? Item 8, summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions?
Noted.
Okay, main item of business today then is item 9, which relates to the GLA key performance indicators. Can we note the action taken by me under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members and Assembly Member Pidgeon to agree the topic for today's meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to welcome our guests. Firstly, Elliot Trahan, the Policy and Programmes Manager for Air Quality and Hydrogen. Welcome, Elliot. First time in front of the Assembly?
First time in front of this committee. I've done the Environment Committee a few times. Okay.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
David Luntz, well known to all of us, now the Interim Head of Paid Service and Executive Director of Housing and Land. Tom Middleton, also known to very many of us, is Head of Finance and Governance. David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff, will be joining us later, I understand at around about 12 o'clock. But we have Tim Somerville, who is the Corporate Governance Manager. Welcome to you, Tim. Okay, we've had a sort of preliminary discussion downstairs, members. So we're going to open up by talking about KPIs and how they will change behaviour, and Assembly Member Pidgeon is going to speak on that.
Yes, we've just had a very interesting discussion this morning. We're all becoming experts on KPIs. Obviously, we've looked through the information you provided to us, but how do you expect these new indicators to actually change behaviour at City Hall? Perhaps I could start with you, David.
Well, I guess it's a combination of things, and clearly, you know, with the new administration undertaking new programmes and old priorities shifting to new priorities, it's taken a while to kind of think through organising the performance framework for those new projects, programmes and initiatives. And I think, and I'm sure David Bellamy will want to cover some of this when he arrives, I think it's fair to say the new administration has wanted to take a slightly different approach, not only to political and policy priorities, but also to looking again at the way that we manage, monitor and review performance. And that's why we've settled, or the administration has settled, on a portfolio approach, initially at least, to look at 5 key priority themes that the Mayor has very publicly endorsed: housing, air quality, which is obviously one of the reasons why Elliot and myself are here, culture and the creative industries, social integration, and I know there was a lengthy discussion with Matthew Ryder on social integration last week, and to look ahead at the future London economy. So those are the sort of key themes, and I think they're obviously set out as very important priorities for the Mayor. And then within each of those themes, looking at not just KPIs, which can be rather a narrow set of indicators, but looking across the piece at the kind of outcomes that those initiatives are looking to deliver for Londoners, to look at a range, a basket, if you like, of performance indicators, to think about what the deliverables are as well as just the narrow KPIs. So what are the success measurements of each of those initiatives? And also, quite importantly, to integrate perhaps more closely than has been in the past, frankly, performance with budget monitoring. So bringing, you know, budget management much more closely together with performance management against those initiatives. And then finally, I think another very important point is that it's obvious, isn't it, that many of those initiatives that the Mayor endorses and leads are going to have deliverables, but they're also contingent on a whole range of external factors. You know, we are not primarily a sort of wholesale service delivery organisation. And I think that's one of the reasons why the new administration has taken a slightly more three-dimensional view of performance management, because it's not just about narrow KPIs that a normal business or a normal service delivery organisation may be responsible for. We have to think about how the outcomes meet the ground, given that we are usually only responsible for indirect or relatively marginal interventions in some of those areas. There are one or two exceptions to that, I think, and I think it's no coincidence that, you know, myself representing the Housing and Land team and Elliot representing what we're doing on air quality are two areas perhaps where there's rather more direct impact for the investments that we're making, and I'm sure we'll come to that during the course of the discussion.
No, we will come on to those areas. Can you, David, give any example, any evidence to demonstrate what you've just described, how you're integrating performance management with budget management much more closely? Can you give me an example to show how this is actually working?
Do you mind if I...
Or Tom, if you'd like to.
Do you mind if
I
step in? David's only just become the hops, so...
7 days?
We've not had a chance to fully brief him on all this stuff. Besides the general point that David's just been making about the cross-cutting nature of these outcomes, which I think is an important point, the specific thing I'd point to, which is new, which is starting off around now with the first quarter of the new financial year, is the recording of actual expenditure. So the approach the GLA and the functional bodies and some of the members on this committee will be familiar with this over many years, that at Q1 and Q2 people forecast the annual expenditure but don't give the actuals. So the biggest change we're making is to record the actuals, and it won't come as a huge shock to people who followed this over a number of years that what that will show you is that Q1 and Q2 are quite quiet in terms of levels of expenditure, and it ramps up in Q3 and Q4. In some cases there may be good reasons for that. In other cases it should be a more even spend across the year, and people shouldn't be sort of panicking in the last half of the year and trying to get money out of the door. So and that's been a pattern for quite a few years, i.e. Q1, Q2 relatively little expenditure, Q3, Q4 much higher. So I know David when he arrives, and he's at a resilience meeting, so that's why he's not here right now. When he arrives, we'll be keen to point out that he would like, on a quarterly basis, whichever quarter it is, to examine that very carefully with the policy teams and the programme teams, and sort of, you know, is there a good reason for it or isn't there? Should there be a more even spend? Because it doesn't seem... There may be a few areas where that is the right way of doing it, but most areas it should be a more even spread across the year. So that's, in terms of practically what you will see on this committee and what we're looking into, is that phenomenon. And I think in most areas it needs to be challenged. And David is keen to challenge it. He wants to challenge it. I think the kind of three senior people he imagines will be having these quarterly meetings and calling colleagues before it, himself, Nick Bowes as Mayoral Director for Policy, and the new Chief Officer. So it'll be that sort of triumvirate will be, you know, looking at each of those areas and saying, you know, these are your actual levels of spend. And the critical issue there is not only should the spend be more even, but how does it correlate to your performance? So if your performance stats are amazingly good, but you're not spending any money, well, how does that work? You know, and what are the interrelationships? Now, as David's rightly said, some of these areas, there's quite a clean read across between GLA spends money, things happen in the world, in London. Other areas, more challenging. You know, we mentioned social integration. We had a session the other day. It's harder to measure our kind of input into that. So it will differ. Elliot's here today. Elliot's area is probably one area where GLA, TfL, other areas of government, to some extent you can track our investment and see the outcomes of that. Other areas, I mean, culture's another example. Kind of cultural participation, the qualities issues in culture. We have cultural initiatives. But we don't run the West End or something. So, again, it will be looking at how far we've got with our programmes and trying to give you a narrative, give others a narrative that makes some sense of what we're doing. So it's quite a challenging task Chief of Staff has set himself and the rest of us, because it is a more holistic approach, as David said. But you know, we are starting it, and we'll have to refine it, and you will no doubt have views on how we do it.
I think the one thing that's worth adding, if I may, is the challenge we've had from the Mayor's office during the process on getting the qualitative aspects of this right. So, for example, I've had lots of notes back from upstairs over our drafts with big rings around saying, yes, but how are we measuring the quality of jobs, for example, not just counting jobs. So that's challenged people in the business to go away and think about not just how they're setting up their projects, but also how they count things that come out of those projects.
Can I just add, maybe just for completeness, one other point on budget, which occurs to me as well, which I think is quite a good example of a closer marriage between performance and budgeting, which has already come back to bite a few of my colleagues, is a different and a much more assertive approach to year-end carry-forwards. So I think it's fair to say that, you know, there maybe was a bit of a kind of assumption that underspend at the year-end would just roll forward. I can tell you that the new Chief of Staff has a rather different and slightly more disciplined view of that. If, you know, there's been slippage for good reason and it's not impacted on performance, fine. If not, then don't assume that a carry forward is necessarily going to be simply approved. So I think there are a number of things that are definitely moving towards a closer integration of budget management, performance management.
Which is why we want a quarterly, regardless of the quarter number, every quarter we want a Chief of Staff downwards a more rigorous approach, not just saving it all up for Q3, Q4 in terms of the carry forwards. We want a rigorous approach and say, well, you know, what's your honest estimate? You know, what is really going to happen, and plan on that basis and report that in terms of the actual spend, which you'll be seeing shortly.
I called this challenging, and you talked about a process, which sounds like it's a new process, where the Chief of Staff, the Chief Officer, and I can't remember who else you
And Mick Bowes, the Director of Policy at the Mayor's Office.
So we'll be every quarter going through this forensically, a kind of stock take.
Yep.
Is that new? Did that not happen in the past?
It's kind of it's new for this administration. You'll be aware that in the past we've had slightly different approaches under previous two mayors.
They not do a regular stock take of performance at City Hall?
I think I'm trying to, as I'm speaking, trying to recall exactly what used to happen.
So I think in the Boris Johnson days, we had the Investment Performance Board that took reports on performance, and it was challenged there before it came to the Assembly. What we didn't have was the quarterly challenge process to the extent we had at quarter three in the past financial year, and we'll be setting up from quarter one, where we pick themes and the Chief of Staff assesses those based on advice from the performance and governance team to support the challenge. And at quarter three, we also had the Chief Digital Officer involved as a critical friend, which included challenging the process as well, and we'll be speaking to him in more detail to help develop it in the future.
Okay. Can you give me any other examples showing how this new performance indicator is actually changing other behaviour at City Hall?
I think we need to be kind of frank about this. This is early days in terms of this whole regime. I think
just on that point, actually, it's halfway through the term.
It's 2 years in.
It's not early days, more than 50% through.
And I would like an account for why it's taken 2 years to reinvent the wheel.
Okay. Well, I think we've been here before in terms of the regime we had under the current mayor's immediate predecessor. That came in early in the second term, so it does take some time. The development of the statutory strategies, which some of them are coming before December at the moment, is closely linked to some of the implementation plans and some of the projects and programmes. Ideally, we would have had this up and running sooner. So, we're being honest and saying it's challenging. But I mean, it takes a while under any mayor.
Well, indeed. But I mean, the session that we had beforehand, we heard that it took between 7 and 9 months for the incoming coalition government, after 13 years of a Labour government, to get their single departmental plans organised. Now, with the best will in the world, I can't imagine that a mayoral administration is more complex than the entirety of Whitehall. So how do you account for that? I mean, you know, we've been promised this, and we've asked this, you know, we've asked this many times, and we've been promised at regular intervals by the Chief of Staff, by the Mayor as well, that these were coming, and it's taken the thick end of 2 years. Why?
Well, I mean, it's just taken that amount of time to you know, scope it all out and provide, you know, write it all down. I mean, I take your point. Maybe that's a challenge for our planning for future administrations in terms of you know, getting this done sooner. Some of the plans we have are to which come before you in a different guise is to have a proper staffing cohort to do this. So that came before the oversight the other day.
Devise the KPIs in a vacuum, or are you guided by? Because I mean, you're all officials. The Mayor's Chief of Staff is a political appointment. The Mayor himself is obviously an elected politician. How much do they play a role in setting the KPIs?
Well, they you know, the KPIs belong to the Mayoralty of the day, so yeah, they have the final say. I mean,
the reason for asking the question is that we're halfway through the administration.
Yeah.
There is no guarantee of a second administration. He may assume that he'll get one, but there's no guarantee of that.
Yeah.
I would have thought it's in the Mayor's best interests to be able to direct performance in the best way possible, which is why I'm surprised it's taken half of a mayoral term to come up with anything that resembles a suite of KPIs.
I think there are a couple of things to bear in mind. One is, it's not that we haven't had measures of performance and indicators in the interim. So we have been doing lots of project monitoring, and that's come before the committee and the subcommittee. The other thing is it's very challenging because all of the Boris Johnson indicators essentially were defunct by the time the previous mayor left, because they measured projects and programmes that aligned with his mayoral term. So there wasn't a ready-made set of indicators in the way Whitehall can pick up.
I will take you back to what I said about the coalition government, because after a decade and 3 years, it is fair to assume that a new government has completely different priorities to its predecessor, and they managed to do it in a significantly speedier time frame. I'm surprised that the Mayor has sat around for 2 years and allowed this to just drift along.
Well, I think that's a fair challenge. I mean, it's not just like the Mayor's office in isolation. There's the role we play centrally, but there's also obviously a lot of liaison with the policy teams and the teams delivering the programme. But that is absolutely a fair challenge, and future mayoral elections, I think that's something we should look to. We corporately should look to improve. I think that's an absolutely fair point.
Can I just maybe add a word or two as well? Because I think it is a fair challenge. It's a legitimate challenge, and certainly I think if the Chief of Staff were here, I think he would be the first to acknowledge that there is still some work in progress here.
But the opportunity,
I think on the other hand, though, it's important to bear in mind that there is, as we've already heard, a pretty comprehensive suite of performance monitoring reports that are examined quarterly across all directorates. I think it's also fair to say that this administration has probably got to grips with some of the key issues around objective setting and KPIs faster, certainly than the predecessor administration managed to do. And thirdly, I think it's also important to highlight, I think, that in certain key areas which the Mayor has prioritised, there has been a very vigorous and rigorous set of performance management arrangements and targets. I can speak very personally about housing, for instance, where, from very early in this administration, there were very specific targets agreed, not just with the Mayor, but with national government. There's a very comprehensive performance management
that was
regime in that
directorate.
directorate.
Grant, wasn't it?
I'm sorry?
That was required in exchange for the grant. They're not going to hand over £3.15 billion with no expectation of when you're going to deliver it, are they?
No, that's absolutely fair, but it's also the case that, in negotiating that target, it sat very quickly and very easily within a performance management framework that's been very, very well established. So I think some other parts of City Hall, frankly, where there's been a lot more change and where new initiatives have been set up and new budget and new growth is coming through, it's taking a little longer to settle some of those performance expectations and measurements. All I think I'm saying is that in those priority areas, particularly those ones where I think, the mayor is being held to account for some quite direct interventions, I think the performance management regime is a lot more robust and has been in place virtually since the start of this administration.
Yes, but the performance management reports that you're talking about are distinctively different from KPIs, aren't they? You, at the outset of the question, I've completely gate-crashed your question, I'm going to step out in a second. At the outset of the discussion, there was talk about how these performance reports are going to be targeted to budgets and actuals and outcomes. And that's fine. I mean, I think nobody would object to that. That makes perfect sense. But monitoring output or monitor the performance monitoring reports that you have alluded to is not the same as the strategic key performance indicators that are assigned to the mayor's priorities, are they?
Well, I think it depends. I think in some cases they perhaps are. In other cases, I would agree that those indicators need to be more developed. But I would certainly, again, perhaps using the example I know best in the housing field, I think those KPIs are very clear, and I think those are very strategic as well as operational. So I think it depends where one looks.
I'll step out. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Absolutely fine.
I might just add something to that. If you take the example, I mean, you know, the sort of two areas represented today are probably the most sort of concrete, and as David's described. I mean, you take, for example, social integration. As Matthew Ryder explained the other day, I mean, I think a lot of what they're doing is, which makes it that much more difficult, is scoping out what their interventions might be. So a lot of their initial work over the first couple of years is scoping out where they might want to spend their money. But I absolutely take your basic point that, you know, you'd have thought a year in to any mayoralty that, you know, there should be something on the table. And that's something we corporately need to learn the lesson.
The purpose of my questions is not to sit here and beast the four of you. You know, you are all officials. The mayor is accountable for the performance of his administration. And quite frankly, I think the grass has been growing under his feet to a very considerable extent. And I am very surprised by that. I would have thought that he would be much keener on monitoring performance and making sure that it is actually working properly. But perhaps the Chief of Staff and then later the Mayor himself can answer for that. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah,
and then Assembly
so
Member Brown.
we've got these new performance indicators. Can you explain how they are being used internally and what kind of sits behind them?
I think Tim might be best placed because he's the person who liaises with the teams on this.
Yeah, so the majority of the indicators flow from particular programmes or projects. And the corporate reporting is sort of the top of the pyramid in a way. So we expect the teams to be monitoring the performance locally and challenging performance locally where there are partners involved and there are grant agreements. And we have a corporate dashboard for each project that tracks indicators related to that project, but also spend, risk, issues, and other the sort of standard components you'd expect to see in a project and performance management regime. That also feeds into challenge from the deputy mayors around their portfolios. And it's kind of almost at the apex of the performance management process where it comes to the corporate centre. And we have a role in further challenging performance. As part of the new quarterly challenge, we'll be providing notes to the Chief of Staff to help him challenge performance. And of course, the Assembly has a critical role as well. That's why we want to be transparent and make sure we get that further challenge too.
And you're saying there's another layer of challenge there with deputy mayors
Yes.
also challenging their areas.
So they've been closely involved in the process. They sign off all of the portfolio dashboards, and it depends a bit on the deputy mayor exactly the process they go through. But certainly, I'm aware that Shirley Rodriguez has been quite challenging on the air quality dashboard, and I've seen her comments and the queries she's made and asked the team to look into further. So it does depend a bit from deputy mayor to deputy mayor, but it's happening at a number of levels, the performance management and the challenge.
Okay. And then are these targets actually stretching enough?
I guess time will tell. Certainly the affordable housing and the air quality targets, I think
Get
Dave and
on
Elliot
to,
will be able to
yeah.
say more, but I think you'd say they are a degree above what we had before in terms of challenge. It's a good question. We certainly challenged it. David Bellamy and Nick Bowes have challenged the targets during the setting process. If we see that performance seems to be exceeding where we thought we'd be, we will look at the targets again and consider resetting
Consider
them.
revising them if you think actually these are far too
if they
short.
don't look challenging enough.
Okay.
And to be honest, perhaps the opposite as well. If we've misjudged it and the targets appear too challenging, not in affordable homes, I'm sure we're stuck with
No.
that, but we might we might relook at some of the targets in that direction too.
So it's about, obviously you want people to be able to achieve them, but actually you don't want it to be so easy that actually
Exactly, it's about-
there's not enough incentive for strong sort of performance from the staff.
Precisely.
And obviously monitoring trends is really important as well. You know, regardless of the target, you can monitor the trends and see if it's going in the right direction.
A lot of our targets are actually related to funding and to money. And as we enter into grant agreements, that really helps set the targets, because we set targets for our partners based on how much money we're giving them. And we need to make sure we set in those grant agreements challenging, stretching targets to make sure we get value for money. And that helps inform our wider KPIs.
One thing looking through your document, obviously RAG ratings is something we're used to and is quite good practice, I think. But 10 of your 13 KPIs are rated green in your latest update. Some of them I can't understand how they are green. Does this not indicate that actually these targets aren't stretching enough, or that actually maybe you're not assessing this correctly? You've got indicators on economic fairness and skills. You've given a green rating, but you've got no targets to measure performance against, which seems a bit bizarre.
That is a fair challenge. I think the traffic light rating there would reflect, are we meeting our timescales to develop and implement those targets? And perhaps the report should have been clearer about what that RAG rating reflected on. It's more difficult at the beginning, as you say. Some of these targets are relatively new. It's quite hard to be challenging. We don't have the timeline for all of these indicators to judge whether performance is in the ascendancy or decreasing. I sort of agree with you in it. It is very difficult to challenge them at the start, and I would like personally to have a better handle on some of these indicators, whether they're green, amber or red. And I think as we progress, having a timeline of historic data will really help with the challenge.
Do you not think that you need to bring in, and we were having this discussion beforehand, some sort of way of assessing what goes in green, what's amber and what's red in terms of percentage away from your target, so that there's actually a very accurate measure, rather than someone saying, oh, go on, we'll put that in green, when really it should be amber because you're not going to achieve it yet. Is there some sort of criteria you could set out that would make this, clearer and fairer, really?
Definitely. So we do have some guidance that sits behind it that helps teams assess the traffic light. And David Bellamy made exactly the same challenge to me, actually, at the previous round of quarterly monitoring. So I've got some work to do to go away and be more precise about what those thresholds are, where something is green, amber red, or red.
But there's another one. It's PI2. So the target is a very good one because it's very easy to measure.
Sorry, which theme is
this? It's on NOx emissions. So the target is to reduce, using 2016 as a baseline, which is fine. It's understandable why you would start there. A 90% reduction in NOx emissions from buses by the end of 2020. So halfway through, the reduction has been 27%, so less than a third of the target, and its RAG rating is green, with no narrative to explain why it's green. How does that work?
It's busy doing
That's
everyone's
well,
questions.
That's why I didn't use that.
So the reason it's green is we're on track for achieving the end objective, because of the
Explain to
phasing.
me how.
The phasing of the retrofits to the bus fleet, which are integral to actually delivering that overall target, have been phased because the reason that they're kind of skewed towards the back end of the time window is because we've been developing all the retrofit technology you need for the different types of buses.
You
So that's
think
been
that
the
should be
early.
stated in the report?
That's very helpful feedback, and absolutely we can add that in.
Because the danger is the point of this is to hold the mayoral administration accountable for the work that it does. But the danger is that it gets used as a vanity tool to suggest that everything's brilliant. And then a simple question like that, there's nothing in this report that suggests, or on that particular indicator, that suggests that you're remotely on track. Of course, you know, you could say, well, we're phasing the bus fleet and it's going to be in 3 and 4 years 3 and 4, and this is how many we're going to do, and this is why it's green. But it doesn't. And therefore this loses value. It depends who your audience is, I suppose. I mean, who are these reports pitched towards?
Because it doesn't have a 17-18 target. I mean, you could have just put it simply in that column. You know, you've got, in fact, under air quality, it says not applicable, not applicable, not applicable for 17-18 targets. So how do I know how many buses should be retrofitted in 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19 or 19, 20? I can't tell. So I've got no idea whether that's a justifiable rating of green, or whether it should go into this complexity of amber green, green amber, amber red, red, which I have to say I find too over complex. And it doesn't tell me whether it's when you're 10% off target, it goes into amber, when you're 20% off target, it goes into red. You know, it's not very explicable. Sorry to jump in.
Okay, you're also jumping into your section. So.
I know.
No, I'm finished.
I was just getting in before you did
Hold
the other
that
questions.
Assembly Member Pigeon, do you want to
No, I've finished mine. I'm quite, unless anyone had anything else to add
take a
on.
quick response from Elliot, and then I'm going to come to...
From that point, I think that's very helpful feedback. It's part of the challenge that was alluded to, of course, is that for the air quality reporting, we capture a lot of TfL objectives. TfL, for their own scorecard, do have a more detailed breakdown, which we can incorporate into this. So the reason we use 2020 is that the formal commitment made by the Mayor is, you know, for 2020. So that's where we're focusing.
No, nobody's
in terms
objecting
of
to that. It's the way the report is packaged and the way that the data that's contained within it. And without wishing to beat the same drum all the time, this is not rocket science. You know, there's plenty of good examples of how KPI should be done elsewhere, so I'm surprised that stuff like this is news to anybody. Assembly Member Berry.
I'll wait to the housing section, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. In which case we'll move on to Assembly Member Cooper and your section.
Who's just precursored some of my thoughts on this, because that's the area I want to ask about, if I may, Elliot, is about the air quality targets. And I have a whole series of problems and issues with the way they're laid out, but I just wondered if you have any concerns regarding whether or not you can actually meet the overall targets, and then let's dig into what's actually presented to us.
So I think one of the big strategic challenges that we've had in terms of delivering significant improvements to air quality in London has been about making sure that we have the kind of right level of support from government in terms of both the funding that we require and also, crucially, in terms of some of the additional powers that the Mayor has been making the case for. As many of you may have noticed, today there has been something of a quite big announcement from Michael Gove around this, and the Mayor and Michael Gove had discussed this, and it sounds like that there's going to be some positive movement in terms of securing some of the additional powers that the Mayor has been asking, particularly relating to construction as one area, which is also in this dashboard that we produce. So I think the biggest challenge that we probably have is still about making sure that we get any legislation and powers delivered as quickly as possible. There's still a concern around urgency. And I think one of the other big challenges that we've talked about, especially in landing some of the big complicated changes to whether it's the bus fleet, taxi fleet, or more widely with the ULEZ, is about making sure we have the right levels of national funding available to support what's happening in London. As you'll be aware, the government does have a clean air fund, which is available to other parts of the country. Londoners are contributing to that funding through a diesel surcharge through the VED system, and we are trying to make the case for why London needs to be able to access that funding to deliver, amongst other things, scrap scheme.
Yes, I mean, I did listen to Michael Gove this morning, and I was quite heartened to hear him talking about the NRMM and also the wood burning issues. I still do think it is a problem for us not to have a new Clean Air Act, and also to make that clean air funding available for Londoners when we pay in, and then not to get anything out. So I do think the overall context is important, as you say, but obviously there is this specific work that is being done by the staff in the building, and obviously elsewhere across the whole of TfL. Having these sort of top-level 2020 KPIs and also some 2050 KPIs as well, how does that affect the work of the Directorate and the contribution that is being made by staff? Does it help drive towards those?
Absolutely. So obviously we've done a lot of work to understand what the long-term impact of the policies we're putting in place and that broader trajectory that we're trying to establish now in terms of things, for example, like a shift to zero-emission vehicles, which will help deliver some of those longer-term 2050 targets. But we're very, very mindful that the action needed to actually deliver that outcome needs to be starting now. To your point around interim targets, as you'll have seen, there's a huge amount of focus around both 2020 and 2025. The reason for that in air quality, of course, is I imagine 2020 is a pretty obvious date as to why the Mayor may be interested in what's happened by 2020. And 2025 is because of some of the legal drivers in terms of when the government in their air quality plan have said that the UK will achieve compliance. Obviously, the Mayor's view on 2025 is it should be earlier than that, but the established date currently in the government's plan as the formal reporting authority to the EU is 2025. So therefore, a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of either delivering improvements in terms of taxi fleet or in terms of the bus fleet, delivery of things like the ultra-low emission zone, and then also some of the forthcoming work that we're now doing around zero emission zones are linked to those dates. So while absolutely it's important to have that long-term ambition set out for 2050, there is a lot of interim work that we know needs to be delivered to make sure that we're on that glide path to achieving 2050.
Well, I think we've just explored the issue about the level of data that we've got on progress on the bus fleet and why we found that difficult to understand why that's got a green rating. Do you accept that it's difficult for us to judge this as green without more information? Obviously, you've now supplied that.
Absolutely. I think it was a very fair challenge, and it's something I'm sure with, the team here and Tim in particular will be taking away, and we'll be seeing what further information we can build into these dashboards. We're happy to provide that information.
I think you can imagine that my next question obviously is about the taxis, which are rated amber red.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to me, only 10 out of 8,990. That sounds like a clearly red, not an amber red to me. How has that ever come to be rated as an amber red? I mean, obviously our machine that's produced the colours on the ratings has just rated it as red here. So, obviously maybe the photocopier knows more than we do. But, 10 out of 8,990, surely under anything that is a red indicator at this point between now and 2020. And obviously taxis, they sit around idling on taxi ranks and are a massive contributor actually probably to ill health for taxi drivers, but also certainly for anyone who goes near them. And they're everywhere, all over the city.
So I think, again, that's, as you'll have recognised from the way we've structured this dashboard, the areas where we're focusing a lot of attention at the moment is around how we do deliver the targets around the taxi fleet. I think the key point to get out of this is that it's still very early days. So 2018 was when, the beginning of this year is when the new zero emission capable licensing requirement came in. The taxis are now starting to join the fleet. If you look at the natural replacement pattern of the industry, that is going to be delivering a significant number of these taxis. You have huge investment support available, both from government and from Transport for London, something like £67 million of funding to help taxi drivers take up these vehicles. We have worked with the Treasury to actually address one of the big potential barriers around this, which is around the VED surcharge for taxi drivers, and that will no longer apply from April 2019. As a result, what we expect to see, especially as we get the infrastructure on street that's needed in terms of rapid charging, you're going to see an accelerated uptake of these vehicles. The experience we've had with new models of taxi coming in the past has been very much is that you have an initial kind of quite small group of people who are the early adopters, and then word spreads through the industry very quickly if it's successful. We work very closely with the LTDA, Steve McNamara, I'm sure many of you know, who is a real evangelist for this vehicle and thinks it's an essential part of the trade's offer to London, and they're very actively getting behind this. Now, that all said, we think that leaves us in a relatively positive position, but we recognise this is a very challenging target, and maybe this goes back a little bit to what Caroline was saying about we are not just putting in fun targets which we can, easily achieve. This is stretching. And
I can't see a target because it says not applicable 17-18. We're at 10 now. It was introduced in January. How many might we actually anticipate to be adopted by the end of December 2018? Or if your targets run from April to March, how many 17-18? How many could we actually expect to see achieved by the end of the 18-19 year? I mean, I just cannot agree that this is an amber red unless I've actually got those figures. I don't know what the previous trajectory was when we moved from the TX4 to the TX5 and now we're moving on to the TX6. I don't have those figures in front of me, and that's what I want to know is, what does success look like? Because if it's still 10 by the end of December 2018, I'm probably saying that's not success. You're probably saying it's not success. But how am I going to tell between now and then whether we're on track for anything?
It might be, as I understand it, there's now over 100 of these taxis in the fleet, so you'll start to see that pace of uptake moving very quickly. I take your point around trajectories and understanding that. That's something I'm going to have to take away because it's not... I need to talk to other people to confirm about what we can say around that. What I can say is that we are focusing very much on the delivery of this target. We'll be closely monitoring the actual uptake, and we'll be considering about making sure we have the right mix of incentives in place to actually ensure that we do get the delivery of the taxes as needed. Those incentives, I've already talked about some of the financial incentives that we're putting in place, but we're considering what other kind of steps can be taken, including around new taxi ranks and other interventions which are going to really encourage taxi drivers to actually take up these vehicles as quickly as possible.
Which is why I'd also like to see something in there about the number of the taxi rapid charging points as well, because obviously as we drive the number of taxi drivers towards the uptake on the taxis at a level that is going to be meaningful in terms of air quality, we need to see alongside that the number of the charging points for the taxis going up as well, and surely that should be part of that target too.
I think that's, again, hopefully, obviously it's difficult for you guys to do this as an iterative process for each of these, but as officers we are very open to this kind of feedback, and I think sometimes I imagine a lot of this, we work very closely with the Mayor's office to provide this information, and there's a certain level of assumed knowledge, but if there's additional information or background that's required, we're always happy to provide that, and if there's queries you might have about these which might not be appropriate to capture in the dashboard but you just want some clarification on, either me or my team would be always happy to talk you through them in more detail as well.
I think it's just for us though. My problem is that I also want it to be transparent to anybody who's just turned up today, who's sitting here in the hall, so that they can have an understanding. It's about transparency, and yes, I can obviously always write to you and your team, but that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody else who's listening on the webcast or who's here in the hall. And I think it's really important that we're able to do our work, but other people outside of the building are able to have that kind of almost an instant understanding of what is going on with these key performance indicators that are telling us, are we on track for improving London's air quality, which, as the Mayor has said on several occasions, and we agree with, and obviously I'm very strongly agree with, having Putney High Street in my constituency, as you know, that we've got to do something about something that is illegal and toxic, making us ill and killing people. So that's why it's so important. Can I just move on from that to...
Could I ask you to pause for a second?
Sure.
Firstly, because we've been joined by students from David Game College in Aldgate, so welcome to all of you. And secondly, Assemblymember Pigeon had a question on this point.
Just following up on the taxi point, the other thing that your indicator you're not taking into account is there have been problems with the manufacture of the new taxi. You've got to think that there have been problems with the meter, problems with sensors, they've had to recall some of them. If you've got problems with that, then surely your indicator must be on red, because there may well be future problems, as with any new vehicle, that often are teething problems, and they may have to have recalls. So that needs to be reflected in this target, and I think it absolutely does need to be red.
So happy to add additional information on that in there. Part of the reason we feel that, having spoken to the manufacturer, a lot of those issues have been addressed, and we have quite a lot of confidence in their ability to do so. So we don't see that as a major risk to the long-term delivery of this target. That said, it's a helpful point, and happy to add that in.
It is a huge risk.
If I may, just very quickly, Assemblymember Cooper raised a point around rapids, and again, rapid charge points, which I think you're exactly right. It's a very critical part of delivery of this. Happy to add those in. In terms of the glide path of those, you'll have seen the Mayor announce that he's achieved his first target of those, which is 100 rapid charge points in. And there are other targets, 150 by the end of the year and further ones after that, which we can reflect in this.
Before we move on to the next point, just while we're on the question of zero emission taxis, you don't have a target. Assembly member could pick this up. Your 2020 target is set. Your Q3 update is set. Your rating is there. Now, there could be a very good reason why sitting at 10 when you've got a target of 9,000 to hit within 2 years doesn't cause you to panic, because to me that's so far off the charts that it's deep red. Wouldn't it be a good idea for us to have mile markers between now and 2020 as to why you think you can still hit that target? Because the point of KPIs surely is to track your progress towards achieving the goal. And if you're not setting a target for any year, and it just sits there at NA, you can keep coming back and reassuring us it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, and then suddenly it isn't. Because we get to 2020 and you're sat on 10 taxis. Why are there no targets?
So, 2 points on that. First of all, as I kind of set out, we are very closely monitoring this. And as you'll see from the way we said this, the fact is an amber red. We are by no means resting on our laurels or just assuming this is going to happen. In terms of interim targets, as I set out, what we've done our approach to this has been actually reflecting what the Mayor's target actually has been and then setting that out. In terms of interim targets, I'd have to take that away and talk to colleagues at TfL and provide an answer.
I mean, our job is to hold the Mayor accountable,
of course,
for his policies and his delivery. And, you know, it is conceivable that the Mayor just goes along and it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. The 2020 election comes and goes, he loses, it's not fine, it's disastrously bad, and well, it's not his problem anymore because he's gone. You see the problem. You know, for us, scrutinising the Mayor's output, not having anything by which to measure you against apart from targets that set off into the future, that's not very satisfactory, is it?
So I would say to that, obviously, happy to take away the point, and we can get back to you and look at updating the dashboard once I've spoken to colleagues at TfL. I think, obviously, in terms of the time period you're talking about, these aren't 2050 targets. This is about 2020. This is a period of the Mayor's mayoralty where he'll be setting out, what he can achieve, and that's captured in this dashboard.
Yes, but there needs to be a measure of progress between now and then. There is an election in 2020. As I said earlier on, the Mayor may believe he's got that in the bag already, but that may not be the case, and he actually does have to deliver. These things aren't just here to look pretty. There's a reason behind them.
If you don't mind, I'll take that one away.
Okay. Assemblyman Cooper, back to you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to come to the whole point about the overall, we focused on buses and taxis, the overall clean-up of both NOx and PMs in London's air. And obviously there's going to be a sort of ramping up, so we've got the T-charge in at the moment, then we've got the ULEZ coming in from April 2019 in the central section, and then it's going to be expanded out. Now I've got two questions. One is, what are we going to do if the T-charge followed by the smaller and then the larger ULEZ proves to be insufficient, and is there some adjustment, and how are we monitoring our trajectory on that route?
So I think that's a very interesting challenge. To start with, obviously, in terms of our understanding of progress, one of the measures we've used in these dashboards is around emissions. So we're using our atmospheric emissions inventory. But what we're also trying to do is, it's slightly more difficult to use, but I guess it's the proof in the pudding. It's about the actual concentrations. It's about the actual experienced air quality, which results also in whether there is a legal breach or not. What we are doing is we are working with C40 to actually expand the current monitoring network that we have using a sensor program. Further announcements will be made about that in due course, but it will also combine an element of mobile monitoring as well. So we expect to be able to capture a far larger proportion of the city than we ever have been able to previously. This won't be modelled, this will be actual real-world monitoring. And we hope to have that in place in time for the ULEZ in central London, and use that as a mechanism to actually monitor the real-world performance in terms of what happens in terms of concentrations of air that people actually breathe. And we'll then use that as a tool to actually optimise which package of measures that we have in place. And one of the things that we've said in the London Environment Strategy is that we will keep the combination of measures that we have under review, obviously because the Mayor is totally committed to addressing and improving air quality, but also because of the legal need to be taking action as quickly as we possibly can.
Do you have some information that comes from the London Air Quality Network and the current selection of air quality monitoring boxes around the city? And then that's been supplemented by people using handheld NOx monitors and also people installing diffusion tubes. How much are you able to use that information before this new upgraded sensor information and mobile information comes in? Is that useful?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the LAQN, which is a combination of basically borough monitoring stations, but also some sites paid for by TfL and the GLA, has been absolutely integral in terms of actually shaping and informing our policies, including in terms of then actually developing the proposals for the T-charge and the ULEZ, as well as all of the things like the low emission bus zone programme. So absolutely, we use that data. I think what we are trying to get is a far better disaggregation and understanding about what's happening in real time, and that will help us strengthen our suite of policies in the future and to make sure they're delivering and report back to you on what they're delivering in that transparent way that you rightly want.
So presumably that information from the London Air Quality Network and those air quality monitoring boxes is what's also driven the decisions about the low emission neighbourhoods and the zero emission neighbourhoods. And for example, I see the 10 most polluted locations should be transformed into low emission neighbourhoods, of which you're saying that 4 out of 5 of them are on track for delivery. Now obviously that means that you're at 80%, so one is not on track. And again, that's down as an amber green. Surely that is just purely an amber. And what are we going to do about that if that's one of the most polluting areas where Londoners are going to continue to suffer? Because to me it's the performance. We can't just be monitoring what you're doing about the buses, the taxis, the T-charge and the ULEZ. We also need to be worried about those hotspots and difficult areas that are beyond even the expanded ULEZ boundaries. So what's going to happen if we've got a target here that's only at 80%?
So I think that's a fair point. I think what's happening, the reason why I think it's still an amber green is because the issue that we actually had in relation to Ilford, which is where that location of the low emission neighbourhood is, has been resolved. The challenge is that you had an intersection between the North Circular and 2 borough-controlled A roads. It's a very complicated site. There's still levels of human exposure, which were concerning, which is why we wanted to tackle pollution levels there and have provided funding to do so. There's a whole range of interventions planned to encourage walking, cycling, to provide shielding, to provide extra kind of space for pedestrians and cyclists further away from the road. As you'll understand, that the nature of that location was particularly complicated, and it took longer than we had anticipated to get agreement between Transport for London and the local borough in terms of the type of actions we wanted to do. We managed to secure agreement from TfL to roll over various bits of funding that were needed to deliver the programme, and now that we are getting that agreement in place, we'll be delivering the low emission neighbourhood as originally billed. It's just going to take us slightly longer to do it. So you're still going to get the same outcome, it's just going to take longer, which is why we made the judgment around an amber green. However, helpful feedback, and we'll take that into account.
Which brings me on finally and very neatly to my final question, which is what are we going to do in terms of transferring the learning that we've achieved from where we've already seen the big drops? For example, I am going to refer to Putney High Street, where if we look at what happened in terms of the breaches prior to where we are now, the council started the process of and I know not everyone is happy about the idea of smoothing congestion and smoothing traffic flow, but they undertook to make some serious changes to loading arrangements, which did reduce the number of breaches, not to 0, but from about 1,600 to 400, still dreadful. And then with the low emission buses all being put onto the routes, it dropped from 400 down to the incredibly low levels that we've seen this year. And although there are still days when the air quality is still well over the 40 microns per metre cube that we would hope to be below permanently, what learning are we able to transfer? I mean, I'm just using that because that's my backyard, so I know the detail of what's happened there. Are there things that would enable us to, for example, move forward more quickly? You've just described a very complex arrangement. I'd be surprised if there is a road anywhere in London that doesn't have complexity of some description, some possibly more difficult. And surely that's going to drive us forward more quickly if we can use that learning.
So I think that's a really powerful point, and I think the example about why Putney was such a success is because of that partnership model with City Hall, TfL, and crucially the borough playing their role. I think it would also, you know, as you probably know, the local community themselves have actually really been in the vanguard of making some of those
Yep,
improvements.
the Putney Society was the first people out there putting the diffusion tubes up and making quite a fuss, and I play tribute to them very regularly, actually.
Yeah. So we are learning from that. One of the ways that we are doing that is in two ways. First of all, there's a framework of action which City Hall helps coordinate and helps the boroughs do, which is called the London Local Air Quality Management Framework. It's a statutory framework of reporting and action linked into areas which have been declared air quality management areas. And what we're doing is we're looking at how we can actually strengthen some of the policy proposals that are included in that to further encourage borough cooperation, TfL and City Hall. And crucially, to make that really happen, what you then need is some funding to help. And that's why we're going to be trying to align the next round of the Mayor's Air Quality Fund to actually help deliver some of those really evidence-led, high-impact interventions. You gave a really good example around what you can do in terms of deliveries and servicing activity. It's not just about, obviously, what the Mayor can do through the bus fleet or the taxi fleet. Sometimes local changes are equally important. And the answer to addressing air pollution is that you need a combination of all those kind of measures.
Personally, I'd quite like to see a KPI around that area as well, just because it's so complex and critical. But that's the end of my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, Elliot, you can take a breath because we're going to move on. And David is now in the hot seat. We're going to be talking about housing. Assemblymember Berry is going to lead on that for us.
Thank you very much. If I can start asking about the timing of the housing KPIs and things. I know Assemblymember Bacon said earlier on, we're not here to just beat you up about the fact that it's taken so long to get there. But from what I understand, what you said earlier on, a lot of the information that goes towards these KPIs, particularly the affordable housing information, you said that was already being used in quite a robust performance framework anyway. So why would it take so long for the Mayor to decide to put into his KPI something that you were already collecting and using?
Well, I think the question for housing has been, you know, what are the sensible KPIs? Because we could have a very wide range of KPIs, and I think in the end what we've done is we've tried to kind of edit those back to headlines. So what we've done is we've said the absolutely critical KPI is obviously something around affordable housing delivery. It's the Mayor's top priority. It's where we have funding. It's where we have a very direct responsibility, and where you can see the Mayor's outputs deliver, the Mayor's inputs deliver outputs. So clearly affordable housing gets one in its own right.
Well, before we get onto the nitty-gritty of what there is,
yeah.
That's really my point. When in the Housing Committee, we've been asking for the year-by-year targets on housing delivery since the announcement of the funding in November 2016. And we had to wait not until these came out, until the housing strategy came out in autumn of 2017 to even see a year-by-year delivery plan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that's what's there in the KPIs here is the delivery of the starts of affordable housing under the funding programme is there now. But it's just you said earlier on that you were keeping a close eye on this already. There were lots of data going back and forth between you and the Mayor. And just to say,
I'm sorry, Sean, I misunderstood.
This is not one of the ones that will have delayed things, is it?
No. Sorry, I misunderstood your question. Let me see if I understand it correctly now. If the question is, you know, what are those kind of key KPIs targets over a series of years? In other words,
no, it's towards a question we'll ask David later on about delays. Sorry, I put this off from when we were discussing delays. So it's an initial question, really. But it's this the information that's in these housing KPIs, you said you were using quite robustly anyway. They're not what's caused the delay. Then it hasn't taken time to reach the decision on these.
No. And we've obviously been reporting to the Assembly on a regular basis and publishing data on a regular basis where we are on starts. So if we take affordable housing, you know, we've had a series of, there's never been a time when I've been responsible for the housing programme in London where we haven't had a very clear target to deliver, whether it's either starts or completions for a particular year or a particular number of years ahead?
It took us ages to get hold of a year-by-year delivery plan for the 90,000. I mean, the 90,000 was announced in November 2016.
Yeah.
And it took a very long time to get the year-by-year delivery stats.
And I appreciate that. And the reason for that was not that we were kind of holding back information that we had. It was that this was obviously a new programme with a very challenging target. 90,000 starts by 2021. And until we'd actually gone out and seen what partners were able to bid into that new programme, it was going to be very difficult for us to assemble a schedule over those years that had credibility. We could have taken a kind of notional split and said, we'll just deliver the same number each year to add up to the total, but that would never have been credible. So really it was a question of how long was it going to take us to negotiate those packages of funding with individual providers, bearing in mind that we've got nearly 60. And until we had that data back, it was very difficult to settle on the ranges that we've now got. So it wasn't a case that we had very, very clear, definite targets and we were just holding it back. It's that for most of those years, we didn't have targets because we hadn't done that negotiation with partners.
And so we finally got this, just to stick onto this particular KPI for a little while, we finally got this target of 12,500 to 16,500 affordable home starts in the first year. And obviously throughout the year we've been asking how many have you done so far almost every time the Housing Committee came forwards, and it was very, very, very low. And then just in the final quarter, at the moment, according to the quarter 3 report that I'm looking at here, you were up to 4,125. And then the outturn at the end of quarter 4, which we now know, which isn't in this report, was 12,526. And your target was 12,500, which you set in the autumn, basically, during quarter 3. So, I mean, how were we to use that to hold you to account if you basically set it when you knew what the answer was going to be?
Well, I don't think we did know what the answer was going to be. We knew what the target range was going to be when we gave it to you. And as you say, it was 12,500 to 16,500. But, I mean, all I can do is repeat the point, really, because it was a new programme and we were assembling through a process of discussion and negotiation with partners what they could commit to in terms of firm sites, which was obviously important for the first year target, and then a mixture of firm and indicative programme. It was very, very, well, it'd be impossible, frankly, to have set out a trajectory for where those starts would lie. Now, I know that there's been some raised eyebrows about how do we manage to get from the quarter 3 starts report to, amazingly, something just over 12,500 in one quarter.
Actually, it's a bit more than that, isn't it?
Sorry?
So you did it in a month. Because after 11 months, you were nowhere near your target.
No, that's
in
true.
Month 12, you managed to deliver what you'd done in the previous 11 months.
Yeah.
One jump.
Yeah, so exactly. So can you explain to us what happened in that final month? Because we've got the charts here of what's being reported each quarter, and it's not just this year. Every single year, the final quarter has the vast majority of home starts. Is that builders being very busy in the autumn, or is that something else that's causing
Again,
that?
it's a combination of factors. I mean, one is that, as is the case with any new programme, it's always going to sort of be backloaded, and certainly in the first year or two, that's more likely to be the case. One of the reasons, as you'll probably be familiar with, that we are moving from making completions of homes our key target to starts is to try and move away from this kind of slightly eccentric position at the year end where everything comes in, you know, literally sometimes in the last few weeks.
To be fair,
but it didn't work this. No.
So how did that work out then? Because that's what you've just described.
Well, this is exactly the same position as for starts. Yeah, we're getting the same thing with starts, though.
Yeah, but that's why I just want to make the other point, which is the really key one, which is that because this was a new programme and because, as I've mentioned, we were negotiating a whole series of large new contracts, including these big 8 new strategic partnering contracts with major providers, it took a considerable time to get those contracts legaled and signed up. And until the contracts were signed, it is impossible for providers to log their starts. So what effectively happened as we went through the year is we were agreeing targets. Let me give you an example. So L&Q, which is the biggest provider of new affordable housing in London, agreed to extend their programme over the period of years we're talking about from around 6,000 properties to 12,000. They agreed in return for a strategic partnering contract with us to double their programme. Fantastic news. However, it took a considerable period of time to get that contract agreed, signed and logged. And until it was logged and agreed, it is impossible for any of those partners to put their starts onto our system. So effectively what was happening, starts were coming through, but it was not possible to log them onto our system because the contracts actually weren't in place. So that's why we found, as we got to the year end, obviously I was cajoling my team to make sure these contracts were signed and we could get an accurate figure. We didn't actually get it in all cases until very close to the year end.
So you're saying that when we get these figures each quarter, they're coming through as a result of them being logged on your system. They don't signify the start of the building, they signify the logging of the start that may have occurred several months before?
That was the case in this year because it was a new programme that was beginning. This should not be the case in future because we now obviously have those contracts in place. So we can vary those contracts, additional schemes can come in, but it should be the case going forward that as soon as a start is actually a start on site, it will be logged by the partner. So I don't expect to see quite such a sort of lumpy profile going forward. It won't be entirely smooth, but I don't think we'll get this problem that we had in the first year where starts are not being logged because we hadn't got contracts locked down.
I mean, to be fair, I'm looking at the profile through many previous years and previous mayors, and there has always been a lump at the end of the year. Quarter four has always been the highest quarter, but you think you might have got over that now and we'll see quarter one for this year more even?
Well, I think it will be. I think in many previous years, the key target's been completions rather than starts, and completions always brings more of an emphasis.
No, but I'm looking at starts data.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can't see what I'm looking at.
No,
I am looking at starts data, which also seems
Right.
to suffer from this problem.
Yeah, and we are doing everything we can to try and avoid that. I am not going to sit here and say there will be an absolutely smooth line and there'll be no year-end lumps, because clearly, because we're measured on year-end targets, we're all very keen to make sure that we deliver, which does mean there's more emphasis, which means I'm sure there'll continue to be a blip. It's also the case that not just us, but most of our partners also operate to March 31 year end, so there's always a budget pressure at that point. But by focusing on starts rather than completions, it should be easier, and we are doing everything we can to try and ease that trajectory and not have this, slightly crazy, eccentric year-end position. It's not something I like. It's not something the team likes. And I know it's not something you're particularly fond of either.
So, yeah, this is the question about whether this is the right KPI. The other question is, what defines a start on site? As far as we can tell, this is when planning permission is activated. And, I mean, I've experienced this in my own area. I think we're all quite aware of people whose planning permissions are about to lapse, who go and, dig a little bit or knock down a bit of a building or put up some hoardings, or that shouldn't really count, to activate their planning permission so as not to lose the planning permission. It doesn't necessarily mean they're intending to build what they've got permission for. Quite often they're just trying to preserve the old one so they can apply for some sort of amended permission and do it later. That's still the definition of a start though, isn't it? That you're counting?
Well, no, not really. Our definition of start is not the same as a planning definition of start.
Okay.
So I mean, I'm happy to sort of send you the detail of it, Sian, if that would be helpful, to send it through to the committee. But starts on site are triggered by a definition that's contained in the Capital Funding Guide for Affordable Housing, and it needs to comprise a number of things. Obviously, a legitimate planning consent, but a building contractor has to take possession of the site. That's number one. The registered provider and the building contractor have both signed and dated the building contract, number two. And number three, the start on site works have actually commenced. And by that, we have a range of definitions of what those contracted start on site works comprise. So it can mean a whole series of things, from beginning work on foundations, the laying of underground pipes or mains or other sorts of infrastructure, constructing or laying out roads, or in some cases demolitions of existing properties or service diversions. So this is not just, we've got a planning consent and someone's put a spade in the ground. There are a series of events that have to take place before we will register a start on site.
Okay, that is useful to know.
Yeah.
The report we have here has three targets, and that's the one target that relates to affordable housing. There's also 6 work streams, and one of the work streams that you have, PR3, is around housing delivery more broadly, because the target we just described is about the delivery of homes under the Mayor's funding programme only, and PR3 has wider things that are in the strategy, things like the viability work that's going on to affect developments more widely, and then the London plan. Do you not think there should be a target, a proper KPI, to measure the Mayor's achievements more broadly in terms of affordable housing? I know that within the housing strategy, there's an outcome indicator, which is an overall increase in the stock of social housing, a net increase in how much social housing there is. And do you not think there should be something in these targets to reflect that, where the Mayor has plenty of levers and we need to be measuring how well he's pulling them?
Yeah, I think that's a fair challenge, and it's something that we've given some thought to already in the team. I think the key point under workstream 3, I guess, is that obviously if we're going to see an increase in affordable housing, then arguably we need to see an increase in affordable housing supply across the piece. That's not only a good thing because we need more of all kinds of housing, particularly at the non-luxury end, but secondly, of course, because most affordable housing is delivered as part of wider tenure housing projects. So on every level, it's important. And that's why the housing strategy, I think, deals with this. It's obviously why the draft London plan is so important. And there are or will be, I think, some KPIs around London plan implementation that will help there as well. As I say, I mean, because we are effectively sort of starting out on a new era of KPIs and performance management with this administration, as we heard earlier, we were keen to try and keep the key performance indicators and targets kind of nailed down, to a few absolutely key essentials: affordable housing delivery, rough sleeping homelessness, and a very major new initiative that this Mayor's begun, which of course is the landlord database. But I take your point, Sian, and it would be very useful to get the Assembly's feedback on whether we need a richer suite of indicators.
I think saying something around planning, because that is such an important part of the work in this building, well, not necessarily in this building anymore, that needs to be measured. In terms of the second KPI in housing, the number of renters empowered to check the Mayor's rogue landlord and letting agent checker. According to a press release this morning from the Mayor, this is done. All the boroughs are in this. Is this far? I mean, this is far too easy a KPI. Surely we need to replace it. You've done it already.
I think what you meant to say is we've been far too successful. But
it didn't look that hard in the first place, to be honest. In terms of a key performance indicator.
Yeah, and I think obviously because this is a completely new initiative, it was quite difficult to know where to pitch a KPI or a target, and so we obviously said the 500,000 by March 18, and then 1.5 million by 2020, and we got to both of those faster than we expected. And as you rightly say, this morning, the Mayor's confirmed that every single London borough is now signed up, which is terrifically good news. I mean, what I would say is that obviously means that we now need to give some consideration to what we do with these KPIs and whether we change them, which I think we'll obviously need to. I would just add, though, that this has been an astonishingly difficult and complicated project to get underway from a standing start. Managing data protection, gathering all the information, getting all the boroughs on board and other agencies has been a major piece of work. And certainly if you compare and contrast what London government has managed to do with this landlord database with, dare I say, central government's efforts in this respect, I think, we are very, very well ahead of the curve. So, I mean, I take your point that this maybe didn't look challenging enough, but I personally feel that, you know, it's been a big success story, and I'm quite pleased with the progress we've made.
Would you be willing to take feedback from either this committee or the Housing Committee or both on replacement KPIs?
Definitely.
And maybe additional ones
please.
here?
That'd be helpful.
How are these KPIs used on a day-to-day basis in terms of the directorate?
Well, they're really quite fundamental, and as I was suggesting earlier on at the beginning of the session, you know, obviously if we take the key affordable housing KPIs, I mean, these are absolutely locked into the DNA of my directorate. The teams are focused on, you know, not just the headline KPIs, but the quarterly targets and expectations and performance management review mechanisms that sit behind them. It is a very operational environment. It's very performance driven. Everyone knows exactly what is expected of them, and I think I think you'd find if you came and spent, you know, a day or two with us in the team, you'd find that, you know, there's a very clear focus on delivery and a very clear understanding of what's expected. So, you know, I would say these run pretty seamlessly through the directorate. It's also the case, I'd say, that James Murray, as the deputy mayor responsible, is also, I can promise you, all over these statistics and expectations, and meets with us on a monthly basis to review them. And indeed, my own management team obviously meets every month separately to review progress against targets, to look at risk registers and address any issues that we need to mitigate those risks.
And presumably you look at more than just these 3 targets. There are targets within each of the work streams that are measurable too on an internal basis?
Yeah. So, I mean, to give you just 1 or 2 quick examples, the housing zones programme's perhaps a good one, where, you know, there's no headline corporate KPI, although we have a target of 90,000 starts against the housing zones programme. But, you know, the housing zones initiative is something that is monitored and managed, again, on a monthly basis. It's reported through to the Deputy Mayor. So I think that's quite a good example. Another one is GLA land. You know, how we're doing with the various strategic land projects. Now, again, we don't have a separate sort of headline corporate KPI on that, partly because nearly all of the strategic land projects were actually commissioned and contracted in the previous administration rather than the new one. But each one of those major projects has a project line, a set of targets and deadlines, and we, again, have a strategic land review group that reports through to the Deputy Mayor.
Is there any reason why we can't see those sort of lower down targets and achievements? It's the sort of thing we ask about in MQs, but guessing the right MQ, asking at the right time is not always possible.
No, there's nothing that I've mentioned that wouldn't be happy to share with the Assembly members, the relevant committee.
Okay, we'll follow up on that. Sorry, I'm trying not to take too much time up. I want to ask about the letter that you sent about affordable housing statistics and the fact that rather than publishing a monthly outturn of starts and completions, which used to come through about 3 weeks after the end of each month, you were going to switch not to quarterly, you were also informing the budget monitoring subcommittee quarterly. You're going to switch away from that to a 6-monthly report. I think November was going to be the next one. I think presumably that's Q1, Q2 reported in November, and then at the end of the year, 6 weeks after the end of the year, Q3, Q4. Can you explain that? As far as I can tell, it's because you're trying to make them into actual statistics. But can you explain that, and whether or not we'll still get quarterly updates as part of the KPI review?
So this relates to the UK government's use of this basically relates to the UK government's use of statistics code of practice, and the commitment that the Mayor made. I think, David, this was an election manifesto commitment, if I'm not mistaken, that the GLA should not only sign up to that code of practice, but also make sure it's implemented. And that code of practice means that we should publish our statistics in a way that complements and matches the way the government publishes its own statistics, and the way that the government not only collects statistics but then validates those before they are published. And the government, as you may know, has moved to biannual reporting of its affordable housing performance. And so to remain consistent with that, and within the UK use of statistics code of practice, we should do the same. So that was the reason for writing to the chair of the committee. Now I think there was an exchange, I think last week at Mayor's Questions, and I think the Mayor, who obviously wasn't briefed in detail on this, I think undertook to look at it and respond, which we duly will. I've not had a chance to discuss that with the Mayor or the Mayor's office yet. We will be doing so, and I'm sure you'll be getting a clarification in due course.
I mean, because I think we would all want to have like, actual statistics, properly verified data coming through. And that's probably a good thing. We can compare with other regions and all of the benefits that there are. Yeah. However, in terms of monitoring these KPIs, in terms of the budget monitoring subcommittee, would we still be able to get numbers to the key numbers that we need to monitor you, even if with caveats that these are not yet statistics, they may change? The government does sometimes put out numbers that are not yet statistics with those warnings.
Yeah, and obviously we will continue to collect those on that basis. We're not going to wait until 6 months elapses before we know what's going on with performance. So yes, but it will not be accredited at official statistics level.
Still update the London Development Database spreadsheet that gets put out once a month on a monthly basis?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I know the answer.
Okay.
I don't know how that sits against the code of practice.
Because we all know.
Do you know, Tim?
I know in general that the performance team, my team's been having discussions with the intelligence team that's leading on the work to sign us up to the code of statistics about how we manage all this performance information and whether it all needs to be classed as official statistics, in which case it is problematic, or it's management information, in which case a different regime applies and we can keep publishing things as quickly as possible. So we're working through those issues at the moment.
Okay, I mean those of us who use the London Development Database output regularly, we're well aware of its limitations in terms of it's what you've latest that you've got from councils and their planning departments, and it's not always completely.
There's always a lag.
There's some things. It's really obvious that some boroughs have up-to-date data and some are older, and there's caveats there, but it's a very useful tool, nevertheless, sort of as live data rather than statistics. And there's one final question. The rough sleeping work, the KPI there is defined as the percentage who are supported by mayoral programmes who exit rough sleeping. And that statistics, that target's going quite well at the moment. As the work progresses, as work gets more targeted towards groups with higher needs, is there a danger that's going to slip back, but in a way that's understandable? Is that the right target again to be measuring things by?
I think, to be honest, it's a better target than we had in the last administration. And I think, exiting rough sleeping is obviously what we're looking to do, rather than, for instance, you don't sleep out for a second night. And I think you're right. The current last year's figure of 87% exiting rough sleeping was encouraging. I think you're also right, though, that again, as one drills down, you can see that the complexities of particular groups of rough sleepers possibly needs unpacking and looking at in terms of KPIs. It's reflected, I think, in the range. I think we've got now. How many have we got? We've got something close, I think, now to 20 separate sort of funding streams and contracts with different organisations. And at first glance, that looks incredibly complicated, and why do we need all these? And I think the answer is largely because there are so many specific groups with specific needs, and targeting those with specific programmes and projects is really important. I think it's a really good point to make, and I think it's something that, again, I'd be happy to take away and discuss with the team and discuss further with Assembly.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to welcome the Mayor's Chief of Staff. David Bellamy has arrived with commendably good timing because we're now on to your section. Assemblymember Hall's going to lead on that.
Mr Bellamy, I'm new to this committee and I have to say I am deeply shocked by the lack of KPIs, key performance indicators, and for the amount of time that it's taken to put them in place. So exactly why has it taken 2 years to put these in place?
Firstly, apologies to the committee that I wasn't able to be here for the start of the discussion, and the Chair knows the nature of my prior external commitment. I think, and I hope that it won't stop me if I start duplicating what colleagues have said in my absence. I think we discussed this previously in the committee before you joined, Assembly Member, and I think the first thing I would say is that there's unanimity of view, I believe, between members of the committee and the Mayor's office and officers involved in this, of the importance of getting these into place, and that it's something we all want to see happen, and it's also something that we want to see is as effective as possible, not just doing it for the sake of doing it so we can say we've done it, because we need to use this to both ensure effective delivery and also to ensure that that can be held to account both by the Mayor's office, by the Assembly and by members of the public. I think in terms of what we've been trying to do, we've been trying to ensure that the approach we're taking works as a methodology before we roll it out more widely, and I'm sure that you'll have gone through in detail while I wasn't here some of the aspects of that and challenges of that. We also have to ensure that the targets and so forth we're setting are aligned with the Mayor's strategies, and of course they're only now reaching the point of being at their final stage, and also they are sorry, that's my train of thought. So the Mayor's strategies are just coming through, and that's required obviously a significant amount of officer time to work on the strategies, and hopefully now that will free a bit more officer time to really focus on the delivery and the measures. So I guess the other thing I would say is that we're going here to a level of detail and a level of focus that I don't believe the GLA has before. I think it's both somewhat of a culture change for the organisation, which we will need to manage through. I think it's also something that will require resource to do that. That's why, in response to the then Head of Paid Services consultation with the Mayor around the recent restructure of the finance and governance teams, the Mayor's response was that we needed to bring additional resource into this area in order that we can make more progress, because the Mayor is keen to see us do that.
Well, I don't understand that, because underlying all of these KPIs, you've got lots of other information that you could take it out from. Do you think 2 years is an acceptable time, halfway through this administration?
I think I understand the reasons for why we are where we are. I absolutely would like us to be further on, and while I know that we're a lot further on in our progress than previous administrations in this regard, that doesn't mean that I think that's something I'm comfortable about, and that's why the Mayor has asked for more resource to be put into this so that we can speed progress.
But we've gone through some of these KPIs, and quite frankly, I've again been astounded by constant comments from us, and none of us are experts on this. With respect, you gentlemen are the experts. Very fair challenge, it's been said several times, interesting challenge, helpful feedback, mainly because my colleagues have picked out things with the KPIs that aren't sufficient. Well, we are not the experts. You are. It's taken you 2 years, which I think is extraordinary, to be able to come up with a set of KPIs. And my colleagues have pulled lots of these apart or said there needs to be additional bits to them. Now, you're the experts doing this. How on earth are we to challenge you if we've got no proper performance indicators to challenge you with?
Well, what I would say, obviously not having heard the discussion, is that firstly, and I've said this before the committee on a number of occasions, that we really do welcome the feedback. This is definitely a journey. It's something that we want to get better at. The scope of the ambition here in terms of focusing on outcomes and really trying to be quite clear about how the GLA is driving those. It's something I think is new for the organisation, and yeah, in that sense, that the feedback is very welcome, and we will get it better. What I would say also, if it's a matter of timelines, you've been, I know, focused this morning on the housing and air quality performance areas. We provided the drafts of those to the committee, I believe, back in last July, and so it's great to now have your feedback, and then we will take account of that.
What you say it's a culture change. I don't understand that either, because Mr. Somerville said earlier that the deputy mayors have dashboards, they absolutely hold to account those, and I quote, if they hold to account partners, quote, if they give them money, they must understand, they need to understand the importance of holding them to account, i.e. the partners. Well, you must understand the need for us to hold you to account, which takes us back to the beginning again. If that's what you're saying, if the deputy mayors have got the information they need to hold partners to account, why on earth haven't we had the information that we need to hold you to account?
Firstly, in terms of what deputy mayors and they do, the projects that the GLA work, which will be overwhelmingly the things where we're dealing with external partners, that is published and provided to your subcommittee, so we absolutely do make that available, have done throughout this administration, and so that is there. I think where the culture changes is about how we bring things together corporately, rather than each department and unit focusing on things from their own perspectives. And yeah, it's that bringing it together, it's that aligning it with our financial monitoring as well, which is something that's not been done before, and it's something I'm very keen to see that is the path that we're going down now, and we need to do more of that.
So do you think this is the final set of KPIs, or do you think you'll be changing them?
Well, first thing, as I say, I genuinely welcome the committee's feedback, so whether that's through the transcripts, whether it's through notes colleagues have taken, whether you wish to write, we will look at that. We absolutely do want to strengthen this. We don't want to, I think, in terms of this documentation, have so much there that we lose focus on the absolute top priorities for the mayor, because this building does generate an awful lot of information. But absolutely, we do want to see this develop and continually improve.
I'm sorry, if I may, Chair, I wouldn't want anyone to think we spent 2 years not doing any performance monitoring. I mean, we have an annual budget setting process. There's plenty of challenge in that process. All the restructurings that come to your committee, there's a challenge behind each of them in terms of the resources devoted to them. So it's the challenge has been to synthesise this into a document. As I said before, I absolutely take on board your points about the delays in that happening, and none of us are hiding that it's taken longer than it should have done. But there has been constant performance monitoring over the last 2 years. All the projects that were monitored previously have been monitored and reported to yourselves. Dave's just mentioned something we alluded to earlier about linking it to the financial side, and it's an attempt to, in a cross-cutting way, bring it all in front of you. So it's not that there hasn't been any. It's how we've described it to you that's changing.
I believe this committee has been asking for 2 years of KPIs, and you've actually taken through 2 budgets without any KPIs.
All the stuff that you've seen today was in place for the previous budget cycle. As I say, drafts of housing and air quality were with you as early last July. So as we've been doing that, we have been producing it and continuing our usual practice of providing project monitoring information to the subcommittee on a quarterly basis.
There's obviously been a lack of performance measures, which makes it very, very difficult for this committee to operate, I would imagine. I shall be finding out. While I'm at this stage, I'm used to looking at RAG performance data, but I'm absolutely not used to looking at RAG performance data that just says mayor will not set a target not yet set, no target. And yet you've delightfully given yourself green on all of those. Obviously I'm missing something. Can you explain that to me?
share an example, then that would probably be the best.
Yes,
way to explain
under
it.
culture and creative industries, future economy,
Okay.
page 13. Oh no, that would be ours.
Right.
You can't see my notes.
Right, I found culture and creative industries. Sorry, which one was it then? Was
So it would be P12, it would be P11, P12A. So you've got target not yet set, no target, no. Mayor will not set a target. I mean, you must have seen these.
I did. To be frank, it was about 3.5 months ago, so I don't necessarily have my comments at the forefront of my mind. It does sound like something that I raised actually as well. It's certainly something that we want to monitor. I don't know, Tim, if you can remember, was a particular reason why we didn't set a target at that stage?
Certainly setting a target for 2020 would be very difficult just because of the PI2 on the culture dashboard. Because we don't have the foresight of which grant and funding agreements we're going to enter into, and it does vary from year to year. We don't know what external funding we're going to lever in. So what we're doing with that indicator is trying to track it against a baseline to determine our performance. But
how is that a KPI? I don't understand. I can see why you would want to monitor achieving external funding into cultural projects in London. That's fine. And I can see why you might want to compare it to the baseline data of the final financial year of the previous administration. That all makes complete sense. But if it's not something you can affect particularly, you don't have an objective, there is no target output for 2020, then how is it a key performance indicator?
Well,
it's just a piece of information, isn't it? But it's not a KPI.
We have tried to take a more rounded approach here. So this isn't just about key performance indicators for us. It is about portfolio
what you need to understand
management.
from our perspective is that these need to be meaningful. Yeah. So you're monitoring the what's happening in this particular area, which is fine, and I don't in any way pour cold water on that. But you've given yourself a RAG rating. What is that against? What is that measured against?
And what's
How is that meaningful?
It's just one of you'll put that in as your top 3. I don't see how it can even get in there as one of 3 that are being presented to us. How can we measure performance?
I absolutely take that point. I mean, I think we can affect this one because the better our cultural work, the more money we'll put.
If you can affect it, why is there no target?
I think.
So the thing is, I mean, I'm not in any way decrying the fact that you should be looking at this area. Of course you should. That's perfectly fine. But for key performance indicator reports to have any meaning whatsoever, there needs to be a direction of travel. There needs to be some basis for the green RAG rating that you've given yourself. And you're just telling us that there isn't.
So I think what I would say, and I hope this matches what I said when we did the meeting 3 months or so with the culture team to review this, and we hope we'll see this reflected going forwards, is that I think firstly I would agree with the committee that if you don't have a target set, you can't really give a RAG rating against it. Yeah, it's clearly then there's a subjective view, and we shouldn't be trying to get into subjective views. I think what we would want to see in this area is very much is that of the opportunities that are available to leverage match funding, complementary funding, that the team are doing an effective job of doing that. And so the question then is, how do you measure performance against the opportunities that are available? I think then you start seeing how do you assess the size of those and what is your target, and it becomes difficult. But I think there's probably room for more of a discussion with the culture team to see what ways there are of doing that. But whether we say, well, yes, we can, or we can give a range, or we say, well, we should look at multiple years historic data and use that to ensure that our performance is keeping up there. I think we need to do that. I can see the challenges there, but from a management perspective, we need to see that the team have been effective in bringing this money in.
On the whole,
I would agree with that, and as Chief of Staff, it is your responsibility, isn't it, to make sure that this is all monitored correctly?
I think it's I'm quite happy to accept the responsibility for it. In terms of the Mayor's office, we absolutely do want to get this stuff right and see it there. Obviously it's a responsibility of officers to do that, and we try and work with them and provide the best guidance and feedback we can, just as the committee does. And as I say, I've never encountered anything but willingness to try and progress this as quickly as we can and get it right. I'm very glad that probably one of the first things David did when taking over as interim head of paid service was to accept the Mayor's response to the consultation about the finance and governance team, about the need to put more resource into focus on this. And I look forward to those roles being filled as quickly as possible in order that we can increase the pace on this activity.
But it looks to me as if there hasn't been enough questions to officers, because if not, you would have asked these questions yourself. It shouldn't be for us to. I would have hoped that you'd have been all over this like a rash, quite frankly.
We held meetings in February. I think February, probably some slipped into March given the budget timescales, with each of the 5 areas, and we did go through and ask questions and make comments and give feedback on all of them. So that absolutely did happen. But of course that will only get taken into account in future iterations of this. What you see before you is the same thing we saw at that point.
So how confident are you in the accuracy of the reporting?
So in our going through it, I saw no reason, evidence that information in it was inaccurate, but clearly there is more to do around the format and the way it's presented, work on targets and so forth, and that's, as I say, the purpose of the incremental process we're going through.
Okay, so are you
Sorry, could I just intervene just briefly, just on that point?
Well, I'm just going further to
Yes, just on that particular point. Without wanting to replay the entire meeting that we've had, one of the concerns that I think it's fair to say that the committee has is the interpretation of what constitutes red, amber and green, and some of the commentary that's justified around it. For the example that we trawled all over was the NOx emissions from buses between 2016 and 2020, which is given a green rating even though it's achieved less than 1/3 of the target halfway through the period. And we had a good discussion about when bus fleets are coming out and things like that. That kind of thing needs to be in the report to justify some of the ratings. Don't want to redo that whole debate, but it would be worth, I think, reviewing the transcript.
I agree. That is the sort of thing that I was questioning, and one of the challenges sometimes is in an area where you're not going to get linear progress through the year, how you assess whether you're on track. I think the housing starts, which I'm sure you talked about, is probably the classic example of that. But there are others. It sounds like that is one of them. And absolutely, we where it's not apparent about the reason for the rating, we do need to find a way of explaining that.
So remember, Hall, back to you.
Okay, well, I was going to touch on that. I mean, we are very concerned that you've got no major risk to delivery on the air quality targets. Well, if we look at it, I mean, maybe watch some of the meeting back, you'll see just why we have got concerns. I mean, we've also got concerns. There are so many manifesto pledges that have been broken. It seems absolutely vital to me that work within the Assembly goes according to plan and is actually monitored by all of us, not only us looking at what you're doing, but by the departments themselves, and so that we have clear vision on what's going on. Clearly there are figures underneath, because you're running departments, there must be figures underneath. And as I repeat, if the deputy mayors are managing to hold partners to account, it's absolutely vital that we are able to hold you to account. So I hope the next meeting, and I do hope we have more on KPIs, Chairman, I do hope we have a more meaningful question and answer, in that we won't just constantly hear it's a fair challenge, because some of these things really do need to be set right.
I think that's a point rather than a question. Given the time, all of us here have group meetings to go to very quickly. Well, not quite all of us.
I have lunch waiting.
So some of us are lucky enough to have lunch waiting.
Chair, can I just say, in terms of the, it's an important point about accountability is, there's accountability in the Mayor's Office, there's accountability in the corporate centre, and there's accountability in the departments. So there's accountability at all 3 levels, and you can absolutely track that, and we can tell you exactly who's responsible for what, so no one's hiding behind it.
We still have one more session to move on to. I'm going to take Assemblymember Cooper first, then it's going to be Assemblymember Duval, and we might have to go through that at a fair clip. So Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. It's a point, David, that I made to Elliot when we were talking about the air quality indicators, which is the issue about getting information about where we are now, baselining, and also information from other sources. And it seems to me that if you're only going to have 3 indicators for culture and creative industries, and I would like to see some targets, you know, however difficult they may be to set, but we must have some baseline information about, you know, what was achieved in the last year of the last mayor, and also what was achieved in the first year of the current mayor, which we can then, you know, that then starts to set, you know, your baseline of where you're coming from, and hopefully then gives you some idea of the kind of target that might, you know, the quantum of where we ought to be on that funding levered into cultural projects and programmes through match and complementary funding. Because at the moment I've got no sense of, you know, what might be a fantastic quantum for Justine and her team to achieve. So I would like to also see that sort of baseline information included as well, so that because I think that helps us to monitor whether or not things are on track, and I would have thought would also be useful for you, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I think when you look at the individual performance indicators, you see that for each there is a small point about baseline and historic data, which will either give a number or will give a reference to where to find it. Now, what we're trying not to do, particularly bearing in mind that we want to expand this both in terms of the areas of the organisation covered and also into financial performance monitoring, you know, we're going to end up with a pack of paper that's several stories high if we're not careful. But I think it's a fair point to say, right, is there a value for each area in having a document that's basically a static document that just records that historic information for each of these targets? Because obviously we've referenced to it, and so, you know, I'm sure in our challenge of the teams we'll ask them about that, but actually having it on paper I can see would be useful for the Assembly, so why don't we look at doing that?
That would be very helpful. Obviously I appreciate there's some new targets, so it wouldn't apply to all. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, final section, which is around areas without KPIs, and Assemblymember Duval is going to lead on that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go through this at a pace. Look, listening to this session, it very much sounds like it's work in progress, and it shouldn't be. You should be further ahead where we are. We're going to concentrate on the areas where you've got no KPIs, and it's to you, David. Given that the different stakeholders that give the background to the public health dimension and delivery of that across London, how should we hold the Mayor to account for the impact of health inequalities in London? What do you think we should be doing?
So, I know since the publication of the draft health inequality strategy, this is something that there's been some good dialogue on with the Assembly. I think we are looking, I'm not closely involved in this, but I know we're looking at how we can provide those indicators and try and, you know, ensure that the both the use of the Mayor's convening power and then those who have the responsibility and the levers where the Mayor doesn't, so we can have transparency about that, and that the Mayor and the Assembly can both hold those partners to account. So I know that absolutely discussions and work is going on about that, and I believe there's the intention to try and bring some of that to the Health Committee soon.
Thank you. So we're going to look at them. We can expect then a range of KPIs, London-wide public health issues that we know that the Mayor's not directly responsible for, but partners, whether they're the NHS or local government, are responsible for in their contribution to to looking at some priorities London-wide about what they can do. Is that where we think we're heading? Okay, so we're going to get that back. Okay. In terms of not producing something earlier on, so you've got that's work in progress. Was there a discussion with the Health Board, or because the Mayor has set up a Health Board with those partners, not sure when, so it might be an issue, or with the Mayor's health team of why we've not got something before us? I know it's a difficult area, and I know when you're not directly hands-on what the conversation must have been, but was there any discussion with those people?
to be honest and say I'm just not cited on that. I don't attend health board. I'm not particularly involved in that area.
All right. Now, given the listening to the mayor yesterday, I had the joy of that, or not so much the joy of that, in terms of where he was on his environmental strategy. Very big on climate change. Shock horror, you've got nothing here on a KPI about a carbon emissions. Do you know what I mean? Why is that? What's that about? Can you just? I know you've had lots of questions and you've got issues around air quality, but why not carbon emissions? And given, I presume, or is that work in progress because of certain announcements yesterday? What tell us then very quickly?
So basically, air quality obviously focuses on emissions which impact health. Climate change is around greenhouse gas emissions, and we basically treat those as separate issues. There's a whole range of different indicators and work that has been done as part of the London Environment Strategy, and there's an implementation plan so if you wanted a kind of a dashboard along the lines we've done for air quality on carbon, that would be possible, but obviously needs to be agreed with our governance team.
So yeah, in terms of performance indicators, we picked out 5 particular areas to start on. Clearly, air quality is one. It's a subset of what the environment and the energy unit deal with, and so one of the things we need to do is, as we expand the range of things we cover, is expand it out to cover other parts of that unit. And it's going to be quite important that we do that as we tie in the financial performance monitoring, because obviously there's a budget that's held by the Assistant Director, who obviously was before the Assembly yesterday, which encompasses all those issues. And so, yeah, absolutely, we're going to need to address that there.
Right, so finally, between the two of you have got there, that's under consideration that you're going to bring forward something around the carbon emissions, yeah? And the next way you're going to review. We need to pin you down on some timescales here, whether you're working to Greenwich Mean Time or some other city all time.
We'll ask that in our letter to
okay, and then back to you, David. Are there other areas which you're considering setting KPIs on? What's your thinking about that? Of gaps that you think there are gaps that you want to move into, but you're not quite ready to do that?
I think if there's one area that I particularly would like us to get into this approach next, it's regeneration. So regeneration, there's an awful lot of project reporting that exists that your subcommittee receive quarterly, and I think it's in its nature that lists out an awful lot of individual projects that's happening on a high street in Hillingdon, a high street in Havering, and at all points in between. And I think trying to bring it into this view and get that high-level view of where we are with the individual programmes and the objectives, and get a little bit of clarity, because we still do have some programmes there that were started under the previous mayor that are working their way through to conclusion after various delays and third-party issues. And so I think it would be helpful, because one of the things that this approach is designed to do is to be able to say from a high level where are we, and then facilitate drilling down where the data demonstrates there's a need to do that. And I think at the moment we get a lot of information about regeneration, and I think it's so project by project detailed that it's quite challenging for people to look through and really get a sense of where the programme is overall.
It's the second biggest area of spend of the housing.
So on regeneration, we'll be bringing a report to the subcommittee, the Q1 subcommittee meeting, that shows what we intend to measure, and then from Q2 there will be live progress against those measures reported.
The other thing to say is, yes, clearly there are a lot more areas to go in. One's being pointed out. I don't want us to try and do everything until we've got the financial side right, because getting that right is really, really important.
I did see Assembly Member Berry, and we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, just to add a note to Assembly Member Duval's point about carbon, there are many other green issues that are important as well. Things like recycling targets, green space preservation, green energy. Are you talking about producing a whole suite of environment targets?
So yes, obviously now we have the environment strategy confirmed, which is helpful in that regard. I think what we have to do now is we will have to say, well, how do we go from just air quality, a priority for obvious reasons, into capturing the wider array of activities that are taking place on the environment front and bringing them all into the same approach.
From a timing point of view, I mean, if this takes any length of time, we're going to be in the situation where we've been with this year's target for affordable housing starts, of the Mayor putting forward some targets for the environment that are more or less what he knows is going to be the result. If we don't get them very, very soon, is there any reason why we shouldn't have environment targets within the next sort of couple of months?
I think in terms of this format, we have to recognise the resource restrictions we've got in place, which is why the growth in this team is much needed. We also need to recognise what was just said about the reason for prioritising regeneration and the need to get the financial side of things aligned before we take this approach much further. But because this doesn't say that mean that there's no targets that Shirley would have or no other information about that. And so, if it's a case of looking at what can be shared, whether it's through the Environment Committee holding Shirley to account or through other fora, we can certainly look at that.
Okay, we are going to need to draw it to a close. As we already heard, various of us have to go to other meetings or lunch. Can I thank our guests? It's been, I think, quite an interesting discussion. Members, can we agree to note the report in today's discussion?
Noted.
Item 10 is the Budget and Performance Committee Work Programme. Can we note the schedule of meetings for the committee and the subcommittee for this year? And can we delegate authority to me in consultation with party group leaders and Assembly Member Pigeon to agree the scope and terms of reference for an investigation into Transport for London's finances?
Great.
Thank you.
Agreed.
The date of the next meeting is Tuesday the 12th of June at 10 o'clock in here. There is no any other business, so I declare the meeting closed.